Hi, I'm Dean Johnson.
And I'm Robin Hartle. In this video, we'll cover the basics for installing ceramic tile. We'll show you the steps we took for setting the floor, the countertop, and the backsplash, as well as the tub surround in a bathroom.
Now, by watching these projects, you should get a pretty good idea of what's involved in installing tile. Home time is made possible by Chevy full-size pickup, the most dependable, longest-lasting full-size pickup on the road. At Home Time, we believe the best way to get the job done is to use the finest tools.
And the Chevy Silverado is one of our favorites. Equipped with an optional Vortex 6000 V8 engine, it generates 300 horsepower and 355 foot-pounds of torque to power you through the toughest jobs.
And with an available fourth door, you've got lots of room for all your other tools.
And friends to help you use them.
At home or on the job site.
For work or play.
It's no wonder we at Home Time count on Silverado, the truck, to get the job done.
Silverado from Chevy, the most dependable, longest-lasting trucks on the road. Of all the ceramic tile projects you can do, the floor is probably the most work, but the floor is also a good place to learn the basics of tiling.
So let's start the tape by stepping through the process of replacing the old vinyl floor that was here with this new ceramic tile floor. To remove the old floor, we cut it up into sections with a circular saw. We set the depth of the blade to cut only through the vinyl and the plywood under it, and not into the floorboards underneath. Once it's cut into sections, it just takes some prying and pushing to get the pieces up. Then apply a layer of 1/2 inch thick backer board.
The easiest way to cut backer board is with a hardened scoring tool. You run it along the line you want to cut a couple of times. You have to hold it pretty firmly and push down pretty hard. The tool will be cutting through the fiberglass mesh on the surface of the sheet and scoring down into the mortar core. And it's helpful to have a straight edge or a drywall T-square to guide you. Then you snap the sheet apart on the score mark. After you snap it, the two parts will still be hanging together by the fiberglass mesh on the backside. Use a utility knife to cut through that. Fit the sheets of backer board together, but don't push them together real tight. It's okay to have a tiny space between them.
You glue backer board down to the subfloor with special tile setting mortar known as thin set mortar. It's also sometimes called dry set mortar. Thin set has to be mixed up with water or a latex additive. The additive makes the thin set stronger. Pour the additive into a large bucket and then add some powder. Keep adding powder until you've got the consistency you want. You want it to feel like thick, stiff mud. For most projects, you want to mix it by hand. The best tool to do this is a margin trowel. And when you mix your thin set, don't try to get all the lumps out right away. Instead, let it sit for about 10 minutes. This is called slaking. Slaking gives the moisture time to penetrate the lumps. Once the mortar's had a chance to slake, go back and stir it one last time. This will remove those last few lumps. You use a special trowel to apply thin set. 2 edges are straight and 2 edges have square notches on them. First, use the straight edges to spread the mortar out all over the surface. Now make sure you get good contact with the subfloor. You may have to slop out some more to fill out the whole area. Then take the notch sides and comb the mortar out into ridges. When you're doing this, hold the trowel at about a 45-degree angle to the floor. Using the notch side leaves the proper amount of mortar on the floor. The pattern of the combing doesn't have to be pretty, just try to make it even. For most jobs, you'll want a trowel with notches that are a 1/4 inch deep, a 1/4 inch wide, and spaced a 1/4 inch apart. When the area is finished, lay the board on top of it. This flattens out the ridges, and the mortar becomes almost a smooth, even layer. Finally, nail or screw the backer board to the wood subfloor. Now, if you screw, use 1 1/4 inch galvanized screws that are specifically designed for backer board. You should put them every 8 inches around the edges and set them back about a 1/2 inch from the edge to keep it from breaking apart. If you nail, use 1.5 inch hot dip galvanized roofing nails. Then you should put the nails or screws every 8 inches all the way across the board in both directions.
You can see that we laid out and cut all the sheets of backer board before we mixed up any mortar. If you're cutting, fitting, mixing up mortar, and attaching the sheets all at the same time, you have to keep moving pretty quickly, or you might end up with some of your mortar hardening up in your bucket before you've had a chance to use it all. The final step for installing backer board is to mud and tape the joints. Use a 6-inch drywall taping knife to force some thin-set mortar into the gap between the sheets. Then, take 2-inch wide fiberglass tape and stick it into the mortar. Use mesh tape that's made for backer board, not the fiberglass tape that's made for drywall. Finally, use the taping knife to spread the mortar out smooth and embed the tape into the mud. The mortar under the backer board and in the joints needs to cure for at least a day before you can start to set your tile.
Figuring the layout on a tile job can be one of the most confusing things for do-it-yourselfers. We like to start by laying out a row of tiles and deciding on a grout joint size. But once you've come up with the spacing you like, it's helpful to draw up a spacing chart. Our tiles are 11 3/4 inches square. So one tile plus one 3/16 inch grout joint equals 11 15/16. 2 tiles plus 2 grout joints equals 23 7/8, and then 3 tiles is 35 13/16, and so on, up to about 10 tiles. To start figuring the layout, I've decided that the opening into the living room is the most visible edge for the tile, so I'll work from there and see what happens. Leaving room at the edge of the carpet for a synthetic marble threshold, I lay out 2 runs of tile into the center of the room. Then I use the marks I made at the ends of the 2 rows of the tile to snap a chalk line all the way up and down the room. The chalk line represents a grout joint. I'll be able to use it to see how the pattern works out in different areas. Now, for instance, first I work towards the wall opposite the opening. I use the chalk line, my spacing chart, and the tape measure to figure out where the last full tile will be. Then I look to see what sort of cut tile I have against the wall. With this layout, I'll end up having pretty large cut tiles. I'll only have to cut a little off of these. So far, so good. However, it looks like I'm going to end up with some pretty tiny cuts under the sink cabinet. Now these will be hard to cut, hard to set, and they won't look very nice. Under the opposite run of the cabinets, I'm going to end up with almost full tiles. Now maybe I won't even have to cut them at all. Okay, now looking at the overall layout, I would say really about the only problem we have are the thin tiles underneath that sink. This is a fairly low visibility area. I would say we probably just go with what we've got. I think it'll work good. Now, realize that only covers going this way in the room. Now we have to figure out the layout going this direction. Once again, I've decided that the doorway into the living room is the most visible spot in the layout. I want to center the tile in the opening, and I'll be left with 2 half tiles on either end. Now I mark one of the grout joints and draw a perpendicular line from the mark out into the room using the 3-4-5 technique. I measure 3 feet along the baseline and make a second mark. Then I measure 4 feet out from my first mark and draw a short arc. Now I measure 5 feet out from the second point and mark where the 5-foot dimension intersects a 4-foot arc. Finally, I use a chalk line to connect the very first mark I made with this last mark. The new line will be absolutely perpendicular to the baseline. Now I use this as a reference line and take some measurements and see how this side-to-side layout might work. After checking in a couple of places, it turns out that if I shift the whole layout sideways by 3 inches, I can eliminate a couple of ugly cut pieces. Now, with the layout set in both directions, I can snap some more chalk lines to divide the space up into boxes. We'll set the tiles in one box at a time, and this will maintain the layout across the whole area. You like the boxes to be no more than 3 feet on each side. This is about the largest area you can reach out over when you're kneeling. Now you set tile with thin set mortar, the same stuff we use to set the backer board. I spread the mortar around with the flat side of the trowel. I comb the mortar out into ridges, holding the trowel at about a 45-degree angle. Now it's time to set the tiles. Now you can push them down pretty hard and give them a little twisting action to smush down the mortar underneath them. Now once all the tiles are set, you should spend a couple of seconds getting the spacing just right. Use your layout lines to make sure the tiles are lined up right, and check to see if the tops of the tiles are flush where they meet. Now you might find that one tile is just a little bit higher or lower than the one next to it, in which case you'll just have to press it down a little. Alright, now whenever you finish setting an area of tile, and if you have any mortar sticking out through the grout lines, it's a good idea to get that out of there. And the best way to do it is using a pencil. Just run it down the middle here, pull it out, and then discard that, and then using a wet sponge, clean off the top of the tile. Now if you don't do this, when you grout the floor, you'll end up seeing some different colors in the grout. As you set tile, you should take tiles out of several different boxes at once. Even though the tiles may look the same from box to box, sometimes there are slight variations that only show up after you've grouted. If you mix them all up, it'll help keep these variations from becoming too obvious. Once you're done setting, you need to stay off the floor for at least a day. For my second day of tile setting, I'm going to install all the cut tiles. I'm using a tile snapper for most of my cuts. You line your markup with the center of the snapper. Then you push down on the lever and push the scoring wheel across the surface of the tile. And next, you push down on the lever and this snaps the tile apart along the scored line. There are a few peculiar things about setting cut tiles. If you've got enough room, you should spread out the mortar on the floor the same way you do for full tiles. But lots of times, there won't be enough room, or there'll be an overhanging cabinet in the way. In that case, you can apply mortar to the back of the tile instead. Now this is called back buttering. You put it on just like you apply it to the floor. You spread it out and then comb it out into ridges with the notch side of the trowel. When you're putting in your cut tiles, you almost always want to put the cut side toward the outside of your tiled area. In other words, always put uncut edges of tile together. That gives you the best looking joint. The cut outside edges will usually be covered up or hidden. Now for different types of situations, you'll end up using different types of cuts. Now for this, we're going to be doing an inside corner. For this type of cut, we'll end up using a tub saw. Well, the tub saw has a diamond blade to cut the tile. Plus it washes the blade with water as it spins. The water washes away the fine dust and keeps the blade from getting hot. A tub saw is about the only way you can cut a nice straight inside corner piece. But because the blade is round, you'll probably need to use a pair of tile nippers to break out the little extra piece of tile in the corner. Now whenever you meet up against a different type of flooring material, you want to have a nice clean transition. Now there's a couple ways to deal with this depending on the look you're after and the type of material you're going to butt up against. But probably one of the most common ways of handling it is with a threshold. Now one of the easiest thresholds to work with is a solid surface. You install the threshold with thin set and you'll most likely have to back butter it. And you want to pick a threshold that's about the same thickness as the tile. So at the top of the threshold will be flush with the top of the tile. Now today it's time to do the grouting between the tiles. Now grout is basically nothing more than colored mortar. I mix this up the same way we do the thin set. The main difference is we want to mix this as dry as possible. Now it's mixed, I'll just let it slake a little bit. Applying grout takes a special tool called a grout float. A sponge, a bucket of water, a pair of rubber gloves, and a lot of elbow grease. You work in areas that are about 4 feet square. First you scoop out some grout onto the floor, then you use the grout float to push it down into the joints. Now the bottom of the grout float is padded, so you won't end up scratching the surface of the tiles. Now once you've got the area packed, then you work on getting rid of the excess. Now the first step is to hold the float so that the bottom is almost perpendicular to the floor, and scrape the grout off the tops of the tiles. Now when you do this, make sure that you pull the float diagonally across the joints. If you go parallel to the joints, you'll end up digging some of the grout out. Now the next step is to take a damp sponge and wipe down the surface. Rub the sponge in big circles and keep rinsing it off as it gets clogged up with the grout. And as you're cleaning the surface, you can also use a sponge to shape the grout in the joints. Rub the sponge back and forth a little and smooth the grout out. Now you want to end up with the grout smoothed down in the middle of the joint, just a little lower than the surface of the tile. Now the last step, for the moment at any rate, is to wash off the tiles. Now you take the sponge, rinse it out real well, and then wipe the tile in one smooth, even stroke. Turn the sponge over, use a clean side, to make another stroke next to the first one, and then rinse off the sponge and do it again. Don't make more than one swipe over an area with a sponge without rinsing it out again. Now once you sponge down an area like this, the tile looks nice and clean. But once that dries, you can see that a little bit of a haze sets up. Now sometimes you can let this go for a day or so, but I think it works well, especially given the texture of this tile. To wipe it off as soon as possible, you just rub a cloth over the top of it and just pull that haze off the top, being real careful not to step on your grout joints and destroy those. Once the project is done, you want to seal the grout so that it doesn't get stained. The most common type of sealer is a penetrating silicone sealer. You brush it onto the grout joint and let it soak in. Sealers generally tend to darken the color of the grout a little, although it'll be less obvious once it dries. Now to keep the floor protected, you should probably plan on resealing the grout every year or so.
The second project we did in this kitchen was to remove the old laminate countertop, the dated tile off the backsplash, and replace it all with this new tile. To prepare for the tile, we're first putting down a layer of 3/4 inch plywood. We're using construction adhesive and screws to hold the plywood down to the cabinets. Sometimes there'll be corner blocks in the cabinets that you can screw up through, but these cabinets don't have corner blocks. So we're marking where the framing pieces are and pre-drilling and screwing down through the plywood. Now, as you cut and install the plywood, you'll be setting the overall depth for the countertop, including how far it hangs out over the front of the cabinets. An inch overhang on the underlayment is pretty standard.
Once the plywood is down, we're ready for a layer of 1/2 inch cement backerboard. We attach the backerboard to the counter the same way we did to the floor, setting it in combed out thin set mortar, one piece at a time, securing it with nails around the edges and across the middle, and mudding and taping the joints.
Now, layout is always the most confusing part to most tile jobs. It seems like there ought to be a simple set of rules to follow to get the best arrangement for your tile. But because there's so many variables, it's really hard to get some simple universal rules. However, with countertops, there are a couple of basic guidelines to follow. Now, the main one is that the front part of the countertop is always the most visible part of the job. So your priority is to get that layout looking good. Now here's one common approach. This trim piece is called a V-cap, and it's a real common way to treat the front edge of the countertop. Usually what works best is to put a full tile right behind the V-cap. You just continue right up the countertop with the layout, and then what happens is you're going to end up with a cut in the back of the countertop. In this case, it's going to be a real small cut. But that's okay because it's the back of the countertop, so it's not going to be that visible anyway. Now suppose you have an L-shaped countertop with an inside corner like we do. If you put full tile behind the edge on this side too, your whole tile layout is pretty much set. Now what you'll end up with is one full tile right at the corner, and then full tiles along the front on this side, full tiles along the front on this side, and then cut tiles along the back on both sides. Now, if you're wondering what we would do here, we would have to miter 2 pieces of the V-cap to create that inside corner. Now let's think about another spot on the counter. Say you've got an outside corner and you decide that that's the most important part of the layout. First of all, if you're using the V-cap, there's a special outside corner trim piece. You'd start with that. We'd put that on the corner and then run the V-caps along each edge, like so. And then we'd fill in with full tiles behind them, starting at the corner and then working out. And then you'd have to just live with whatever cuts you would have to make along the back wall. Now, the tiles that we're going to be using aren't actually these. They're a slightly different shade, and they didn't come with a V-cap. So before we go any further, let's show you how to install the V-cap. We set the countertop tile with thin set. We spread it out first and then comb it to leave just the right amount. Our V-cap is the first tile to go in, and I'm putting a little bit of pure silicone adhesive on the back of the front lip of the tile. This will secure it to the front edge of the underlayment. That front edge is part backerboard and part plywood, and the silicone will adhere best to both those surfaces. Once the edge pieces are in, I fill in behind them with the full field tiles. For this area, we start with the first full field tile in the corner and work back. The field tiles have a little spacer bar that holds them a little less than 1/16 of an inch apart. Since I'm working without any reference lines, I want to keep a pretty good eye on the grout lines and make sure they're staying pretty straight. Finally, when the spacing is all set, I cut and install the tiles along the back wall and the side panel. If your tile doesn't come with a V-cap, you can use a bullnose tile, which is a trim piece that has one rounded edge. When you do this, you'll need to use a thin cut piece of tile along the front edge of the counter, and that's what we'll show you next.
When you're laying out a larger counter, you should again figure your tile spacing and make a spacing chart, and then snap grid lines to break the counter into smaller work areas.
We snap one set of lines across the front of each section of counter. This establishes where the joint is between the back edge of the bullnose tile and the front of the field tiles. We also snap a line across the back of the countertops. This establishes the joint between the last full tiles and the tiles that we'll have to cut to fit against the walls.
Then we run a couple of perpendicular lines front to back to separate the counter up into sections.
We apply the mortar and set the tiles one section at a time. Since the tiles are so close together, we really can't wiggle them down into the mortar like we did with the floor tile. Then we adjust them for even spacing, for straight grout lines, and to make sure that they're all flush with each other. And we clean up any excess mortar.
After each section is done, we measure, cut, and install the smaller tiles along the back of the countertop. Finally, when we're done reaching across to the back of the counter, we set the bullnose pieces along the front. At the corner, we use a double-sided bullnose that's called a double out. Now for wall and backsplash tile, we typically like to use pre-mixed adhesives. Now they're not as strong as thin set, but they work just fine for a wall, and the application theory is basically the same. Now the only difference is that with mastic, you use a trowel with V-shaped notches, not square ones. The tiles stick pretty well to the mastic. Now depending on how big and heavy they are and how sticky the mastic is, the tiles may stay in place all by themselves, but often you may need to put something in to keep them from sliding down the wall while the glue sets up. Well, for instance, you always want to leave a little gap for caulk between the counter and the backsplash. Now, once we've got the backsplash done, we finally get around to putting the cut tile on for the front edge of the counter. Now, since we've got a combination of materials here, the backer board and the plywood, we like to use a pure silicone adhesive, which will give us a pretty good bond. To keep the edge pieces from sliding down, we use tape to hold them in place. And when you're putting in a cut piece like this along the edge of the counter, always put the cut side up toward the bullnose. Keep the factory edge down. You want the smoother edge, the factory edge, to be on the bottom. After the tile is set up for a day, we can grout. On the floor, with its wider joints, we use a sanded grout. But with the thinner countertop joints, we want to use unsanded grout. All the steps are the same wherever you're grouting. First, you pack the grout down into the joints. Then you scrape it off with diagonal strokes. You scrub the surface with a sponge to get off the excess. You rub the sponge over the joints to smooth them down. And you give the area a series of final wipes, always using the clean side of the sponge. After a while, you check for haze and rub it off with a cloth. And of course, it's a smart idea to seal the grout after a couple of days.
The final project we want to show you is how to install tile on the wall around a bathtub and as wainscoting in a bathroom. The principles are the same as any other tile job we've shown you.
As always, whatever goes underneath the tile is really important. Around the tub area, we'll be using cement backer board. Run the backer board horizontally across the studs. Many tubs are 5 feet long, so the 5-foot dimension of the backer board should fit almost perfectly. Leave about a 1/4 inch gap between the backer board and the edge of the tub. Nail the backer board every 6 inches along the studs, again using 1.5 inch galvanized roofing nails or special galvanized backer board screws. To get the right spacing between the horizontal sheets, you can temporarily hammer some nails into a couple of studs along the top edge of the lower sheet.
Mudding and taping the joints is done the same way as it is for the floor, although working along the inside corner requires a little more skill with a taping knife. The back wall of a tub surround is a situation where you'll almost always want to center the tile side to side. And basically, you can either put a joint at the center or a tile at the center. You should choose the arrangement that leaves the widest cut at the ends. For us, if we put a tile in the middle, we would end up cutting the last tile on each side to about 1.5 inches. If we shift everything a half tile sideways and put a joint at the center, we end up with cut pieces on each side of 3.5 inches. This option looks better. Which works best for your layout depends on the size of the wall and the size of the tile.
Now, when you're setting wall tiles like this, you want to draw a perfectly level line around all of your wall surfaces. You don't want to assume that your tub is perfectly level or that your corners are perfectly plumb. The only way to ensure that you're going to have nice horizontal grout lines meeting up in the corners is to work off this common horizontal line running around the entire room. So what we've done is we've started in the center. I'm laying full tiles down from that horizontal line, and then we'll make our cuts down here at the tub area. Now, these tiles fit fairly tightly. They do have these little lugs along the side which automatically space the tile, so you don't have to worry about that too much. But because they fit so tightly, you really don't have a lot of opportunity to twist the tile like you do on floor tile. You basically just have to take the tile in your hand and press it real hard up against the mastic. Now, you always want to leave a small gap between your bottom tile and the tub. Now, this way it leaves us enough room for caulk along the bottom so we can get caulk between the tile and the tub. It's the only way to get a waterproof, long-lasting seal between the tub and the tile. And of course, you always want to put the cut portion of the tile on the outside of the work, which will be down here against the tub. Oh, we have a real nice decorative band of tile running around this portion of the wall here, but these don't have any lugs on the side, so with these I'm just eyeballing the spacing. And to keep these from sliding down the wall until the mastic is set up, I'm using these little shims. Okay. Well, once all the accent tiles are in place, then we can continue laying field tile all the way up to the top. Now our top row is a row of bullnose tile. Now these tiles have a round edge which gives us a nice soft ending before the wall starts again. And many times bullnose tiles don't have lugs on the bottom, so that's why I see these shims sticking out again to hold the tile in place until that mastic sets up.
We've moved on to what's called the wet wall. That's the wall with all the pipes and stuff in it. This is where we're going to have to make a lot of little custom cuts.
These wall tiles are fairly soft, so we're able to use a rod saw for some of our curved cuts. This is an abrasive blade that fits into a hacksaw frame. We're also using another tool for making some of our tight curves. Now this is a small router equipped with an abrasive bit. It kicks up a lot of dust, but it's an easy way to cut thin tile.
Now these cut tiles that go around the spouts and handles, they don't have to be perfect since the trim on the plumbing fixtures is going to cover the holes anyway. Now we're running the wall tile up 6 feet 6 inches high, a little bit past where the backer board is and onto the old drywall. The backer board doesn't paint up very well, so you want to make sure to run the tile a little bit past the joint between the backer board and the old drywall. And you can see that we've run it even beyond that because we want the trim piece for the shower spout to land completely on a tile.
Well, we've moved on to setting tile behind the toilet. Now as we come down the wall here, we have a special tile at the bottom of the wall. This is called a sanitary base. It curves out a little bit and this part sits on the floor. Now we don't want to cut this sanitary base to make up for our height in the wall. Instead we want to cut the tile directly above it to make up for that difference. Now the easiest way to install this is to set it right on top of the floor. It also looks real good that way. You can also use this with vinyl flooring. But the point is you have to get the flooring down first before you install the base using this method. Once our tile is grouted, we come back and put on the finishing touches. We use silicone adhesive to hold the accessories, like soap dishes, onto the tile, but only use this for light accessories. Silicone won't do for something heavy, like a grab bar. A couple pieces of masking tape will hold it in place until the adhesive sets up. We also caulk the gap in the corner using masking tape to keep the caulk off the tile and grout. In addition, we put caulk between the tile and the tub, between the base tile and the floor, and around the spouts and handles.
Now we've sort of breezed through these different projects, the floor, the countertop, and the bathroom. But between these 3 different jobs, we hope we've given you a good sense of the basics of ceramic tile work.
If you'd like a more in-depth look at any one of the applications, we do have more detailed individual tapes on each one. We hope you'll check them out. Thanks for watching.